Gerald Eaton, hanged July the 16th, 1957. At 12:05 a.m. on Tuesday, July the 16th, 1957, Gerald Edward Eaton, 51, was hanged at the Oakalla prison farm in Burnaby, British Columbia, for the beating death of 8-year-old Carolyn Moore at Langley, BC, on April the 26th, 1956. Eaton, who guards described as, quote, one of the quietest, most meek and mild prisoners, end of quote, was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. Eaton had no last words. He had killed his victim with both his fists and with a tire iron. Eaton was a lifelong pedophile who had come to Saskatchewan from his native England in 1929. While in Saskatchewan, he would serve 8 months in the Regina jail for the crime of seduction under promise of marriage. The girl was under 16. Eaton, 28 or 29. Eaton moved to British Columbia in 1941 and worked on Fraser River ferry boats, eventually earning his captain's ticket. He was already under investigation for child sexual abuse on April the 26th, 1956, when he enticed 8-year-old Carolyn into his vehicle, driving her to his home where he began to touch her inappropriately. When the poor child began screaming, he beat her until she became unconscious. After driving around with her in the trunk of his car, Eaton took Carolyn into the bush, where he killed her with repeated blows from a tire iron. At trial, Eaton claimed he had run over Carolyn and that her death was accidental, but the jury didn't believe him. Still, Eaton was given a second trial since, in the words of criminologist Neil Boyd, quote, some statements made by the accused to the police were not entirely voluntary, end of quote. According to Neil Boyd, a police officer had told Eaton he felt like throwing him out a window. Nevertheless, Eaton's second trial also ended in a guilty verdict. While awaiting execution, Eaton wrote to Canadian Prime Minister John George Diefenbaker, a lifelong opponent of capital punishment. Quote, I feel that given the chance, I can help others more unfortunate than myself in the penitentiary, and so make at least a partial contribution towards repaying for the harm I have done. I am also asking you to show this mercy towards me, so that the innocent will not suffer too much, such as my wife, who has nothing left, and my son, who hopes to grow into a useful citizen. End of quote. As noted earlier, Diefenbaker hated the death penalty, but he didn't take Eaton up on his suggestion. The victim's father, Lawrence Moore, attended Eaton's hanging and said, quote, I have had two choices in the matter. One was to continue through life with the mental picture of this man beating my daughter to death. The other was to see him hanged for the crime. Only the latter can obliterate from my memory the former picture. Moore also viewed Eaton's face after he was hanged, but said he could still not forgive his daughter's murderer. The primary source for today's video, including the Eaton and Lawrence Moore quotes, was Neil Boyd's book, The Last Dance, Murder in Canada. Newspaper coverage was somewhat confused, with one account listing Carolyn's age as 18, but I put links in the description to everything I found. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Joseph Pierre Richard, hanged December 11th, 1957. At 12:05 a.m. on Wednesday, December 11th, 1957, Joseph Pierre Richard, 29, was hanged at the Restigouche County Jail in Dalhousie, New Brunswick, for the brutal rape and strangulation of 13-year-old Mary Catherine de la Perelle on February the 9th, 1957, at River Charlow. Richard would be the last man hanged in New Brunswick. He took 13 minutes to die. Richard, who was married and the father of 2 children, was a troubled individual and the local boogeyman. He had been convicted of knocking over tombstones in a graveyard and for tying a dog to the railroad tracks. Tying a dog to the railroad tracks before setting the poor animal on fire. In 1953, he attempted to murder a Campbelltown cab driver he suspected of having an affair with his wife, and was given a sentence of only 3 years in prison. He had been released 6 weeks before the murder, and the night of the crime had been seen lurking outside a home where Mary Catherine, known as Kay, was visiting friends. Richard was convicted on forensic evidence linking him to the murder, but the conviction was overturned as, in the words of the Regina Leader-Post for July 27, 1957, quote, "The Appeals Division ruled that statements allegedly made by Richard to police while he was in custody were improperly admitted as evidence at his trial." End of quote. Richard had been held for 2 days before being arrested and responded to police attempts to extract a confession with the incriminating statement, quote, "If you've got a case, if I'm sentenced, I'll tell you before I die." So Richard got a new trial, but the outcome was the same: guilty of murder. Kay's grandfather, Philip, had employed Richard as a lobster fisherman and believed that Richard had murdered his granddaughter in revenge for Philip having fired him. While Richard never confessed to the crime, he did make the enigmatic statement, quote, "It wasn't about the sex. The girl did not die for sex." End of quote. Richard's final words on the gallows? "I hope God will forgive me. He is buried in Our Lady of Visitation Cemetery in Benjamin River, New Brunswick." The primary source for today's video is the chapter on Richard in Alan Hustick's book, They Were Hanged. Another interesting source was an article I found on Richard on the site genealogy.restigouche.net. Newspaper coverage was sparse, which may have been due to the horrible nature of the crime or to a growing public distaste for capital punishment. In any event, I put links to what I did find in the description. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Note: Richard was hanged December 11th, 1957. Ironically, exactly 5 years later, to the very day, December 11th, 1962, the last men to be executed in Canada, Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin, were hanged at Toronto. Thomas Arthur LaPlante, hanged January 17th, 1958. At 12:05 a.m. on Friday, January 17th, 1958, Thomas Arthur LaPlante, 22, was hanged at the Welland, Ontario County Jail for the murder of 30-year-old Edwin Jones on July the 11th, 1957. Jones's body was found stabbed and beaten to death on a deserted side road near Niagara Falls, Ontario. LaPlante took 17 minutes to die. His eyes were then removed to be used in a cornea transplant. LaPlante's execution was the last of 9 to take place at the Welland County Jail, a total which included one of the few women hanged in Canada, Elizabeth Popovich, in 1946. Jones was the father of 4 children, a Hamilton, Ontario steel rigger and Jehovah's Witness field worker. He had the misfortune to enter a Hamilton drugstore as LaPlante was robbing it, the armed robber forcing Jones to drive him to the Welland area, where he killed him with knife and hammer on a side road in Thorold Township. LaPlante walked to Welland, then Niagara Falls, where he caught a bus to Windsor and crossed into the United States at Detroit. He was arrested while hitchhiking near Cincinnati, Ohio, where he admitted to killing a man after robbing a drugstore. At the time of his arrest, LaPlante was found to be armed, had no ID, and had tried to disguise his fingerprints by burning them with sulfuric acid. LaPlante was found guilty of murdering Jones on Friday, September 27, 1957 at Welland, the jury taking 1 hour and 50 minutes to reach its verdict. When asked if he had anything to say before he was sentenced to death, LaPlante smiled and answered, "Not a thing." It was LaPlante's second trial, the first having ended in a mistrial due to inadmissible evidence from an American policeman. LaPlante spent his last night reading and listening to the radio. He refused to see clergy, but was given a tranquilizer prior to execution. He ate a chicken dinner, and his last words were apparently, "See ya, boys." I couldn't find a lot of information about this case online, but I did find a crime flashback article, "The Killer Who Donated His Eyes," by the famous Canadian journalist and crime writer Max Haynes. According to Haynes, LaPlante had killed his victim because Jones could identify him. All other sources are listed in the description. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Fred Montgomery, hanged July the 15th, 1958. At 12:15 a.m. on Tuesday, July the 15th, 1958, Fred Montgomery, 42, was hanged on the third-floor gallows at the Sault Ste. Marie jail. His crime? The shooting death of Blind River, Ontario bank manager J.J. Walter Bridges during a failed bank robbery on October the 9th, 1957. Montgomery's accomplice was his 17-year-old son, Rodney. Montgomery was pronounced dead at 12:30 a.m. Outside the jail, the wet and rainy street was deserted. Montgomery's normal occupation was truck driver. On the morning of the murder, the pair arrived at the Royal Bank in Blind River in a stolen car and entered with guns drawn. When Bridges tried to stop them, he was shot in the chest and died. The sudden arrival of an employee from a nearby bank, not the Royal, a different bank, scared the robbers off before they could grab any loot, and they fled the scene, stealing another car at gunpoint and almost kidnapping the driver's 4-year-old son. The Montgomerys got away, at first, but were eventually tracked down to a farm at Delisle, Saskatchewan, near Saskatoon. At trial, Fred tried to blame the robbery murder on 2 other men, which was hard to do with all the eyewitnesses. A Sault Ste. Marie jury deliberated for 3 hours before finding the pair guilty, recommending mercy for Rodney, who was reprieved, only to escape from prison in 1964 and go on a one-man crime wave, a spree which included robbery and a stabbing. Fred Montgomery's last words on the gallows were, "Let justice be done to my son Rodney when this is found out." Alas, he didn't specify what exactly was to be found out. The condemned man's body was unclaimed, and he was buried in an unmarked grave in the jail yard. No one is exactly sure where, so Fred's present whereabouts are unknown. The primary source for today's video was the excellent article, Fred Montgomery, the Last Man Hanged in Sault Ste. Marie, a Remember This column at SootToday.com, SootToday.com, SOOTODAY.com, and was based on materials from the Sault Ste. Marie Public Library and its archives. If you check out the link to the article in the description, the comments at the end are well worth reading. All other sources are listed in the description. Henri Hector Legault, hanged February 27th, 1959. At 12:40 a.m. on Friday, February the 27th, 1959, 52-year-old Henri Hector Legault, who went under the alias Hector Poirier, was hanged at Montreal's Bordeaux jail. His victim was East End tinsmith Jean-Claude Perrault, 21, whose body, missing both head and hands, was found in a roadside ditch near Montebello, Quebec. Legault was pronounced dead at 12:55 a.m. Legault was an intelligent and well-educated man who proved to be a very dumb criminal. In spite of the ability to speak 6 languages, French, English, Spanish, Russian, Greek, and Italian, he spent 32 of his 52 years rotting in prison. On January 23, 1958, Legault lured Perrault to a Montreal area shopping center with the promise of employment. After climbing into Perrault's 57 Pontiac and having him drive away from the city, Legault punched his slightly built victim in the head so hard. Legault was holding a thick piece of metal in his fist at the time, struck him so hard that he killed him. Legault would later say he only intended to knock Perrault out, and if he had gone to the police then and surrendered, he might have been found guilty of manslaughter. Instead, he chopped off Perrault's head and hands with an axe, buried what was left in a snowdrift, and then burned the head and hands in his home furnace. Oh, and he kept the Pontiac and the $52 he found in Perrault's pockets. Montreal police did not seem particularly interested in finding Jean-Claude, even after the victim's family tracked Legault down, taking action only after the mutilated remains were discovered by a hunter on March the 30th, 1958. Legault was arrested on April 1st, April Fool's Day, and he made a 10-page confession, which he typed himself. It begins, quote, "In a moment of foolishness." At trial, no witnesses were called on Legault's behalf. The jury was out only 23 minutes before finding him, under his alias Poirier, guilty of murder. The Montreal Gazette thought Legault might be the last man hanged in Canada. He wasn't, but we will give him the last word. Quote, "You know, I can't remember having ever committed a crime for which I wasn't caught and punished, and now I am prepared to die and put an end to my miserable life." End of quote. End of Legault. The primary source for today's video is the chapter on Legault and Alan Hustick's They Were Hanged, which identifies him, incorrectly, as the last man hanged in Quebec. Alas, that dubious distinction belongs to Ernest Cote, whose case is also covered on this channel. All other sources are listed in the description. Leo Anthony Mantha, hanged April the 28th, 1959. At 12:07 a.m. on Tuesday, April the 28th, 1959, Leo Anthony Mantha, 32, was hanged down an old elevator shaft at the Oakalla prison farm in Burnaby, British Columbia, for the September the 6th, 1958 stabbing death of Aaron Hetherington Jenkins. Aaron Hetherington Jenkins, a.k.a. Bud, aged 23, at Her Majesty's Canadian Ship Nadeau Naval Base at Esquimalt, British Columbia. It was British Columbia's last hanging. Both men had been involved in a sexual relationship, which the younger man wished to end. This led to a physical altercation on the evening of Saturday, September the 5th, during which Mantha hit Jenkins so hard that small shards of skull were driven into Bud's brain. After Jenkins fled, Mantha consumed a 24-ounce bottle of rye whiskey, then snuck onto the naval base, where he entered Jenkins' room and attacked him with a knife with a 10-inch blade, slashing his right eye and inflicting a 7.5-inch neck wound that narrowly missed Bud's jugular vein. Screaming and covered in blood, Jenkins managed to stagger from the room before he collapsed and died. At first, the Navy believed Jenkins had committed suicide, but when questioned by the police, a distraught Mantha made the first of 3 confessions to the murder. At trial, Mantha's defense suggested that Jenkins would have died from his earlier brain injury even if he hadn't been stabbed, and that this crime of passion was actually manslaughter. But after 5 hours, a Victoria jury found Leo guilty of murder. Mantha took 12 minutes to die. The hangman was Camille Branchaud, Branchaud, Branchaud. The condemned man's last meal was a T-bone steak, which he ate with a spoon, as he wasn't allowed any sharp implements. A 19-year-old who had killed his brother, Robert Chapman, was to have hanged at the same time as Mantha, but as sometimes happened when the federal cabinet was confronted by 2 men scheduled to die, they commuted one sentence to life imprisonment, that of Chapman, while Mantha went to his death. I will leave it to listeners to decide for themselves if Mantha would have hanged if he had murdered a female as opposed to a male lover. The main source for today's video was the chapter on Leo Anthony Mantha in Alan Hustick's book, They Were Hanged. I also looked at an online article, BC's Last Execution, by Nathaniel Christopher, which quotes extensively from a contemporary news story by Jean Howarth, a reporter for the Vancouver province, and the first woman to witness a private, i.e. inside prison walls, execution in Canada. It's intense reading, and I encourage you to do so. All other sources, including some further articles by Christopher, are linked in the description. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers. Thomas Young, hanged June 30th, 1959. On Tuesday, June 30th, 1959, Thomas Young, a 27-year-old Saulteaux First Nations man, was hanged at the Kenora District Jail in Kenora, Ontario, for the murder of Ontario Provincial Police Constable Calvin Russell Fulford, 28, at Ear Falls, Ontario, on Christmas Day, 1958. But Young was to claim 4 other victims during his alcohol-fueled rampage. He was pronounced dead at 1:20 a.m. The crime that led to Young's execution was a sordid one. On Christmas Eve 1958, the former hydro worker had gotten into an argument at a Christmas party, and when his brother John intervened, Thomas had slapped him across the face and then left, ostensibly for home. On Christmas Day, Thomas, who was drunk, was at his father's cabin when John and a teenaged couple, Walter, a.k.a. Jimmy Gordon, 18, and Clara Gordon, 16, arrived, intending to play some records. Thomas had a rifle and opened fire, killing both Gordons as well as his father Albert, aged 47. John and another guest, David Williams, 16, managed to flee to the Williams home. Constable Fulford, who had been celebrating Christmas with his wife and 3 children, was summoned by John and David's father, George Williams, who was also 47 years old. Fulford took his service revolver and, in company with the other 2 men, approached the Young cabin when Thomas again opened fire. George Williams was fatally shot, while Fulford, hit in the shoulder, managed to crawl some 20 yards before passing out. Thomas then approached the unconscious man and, taking the constable's service revolver, stuck it in Fulford's mouth and pulled the trigger. John, who had escaped, ran to the Fulford home to report what had happened, and one can only imagine the reaction of the constable's wife and children. Additional officers were summoned, and Thomas was tracked to his grandparents' home, where he surrendered after being forced out by 2 tear gas bombs. Thomas gave no explanation for his murderous rampage other than being intoxicated, but the Wikipedia article on which this account is largely based suggests his motive was jealousy, as Thomas was apparently unhappy that Clara had married Gordon, and he appears to have raped her during his killing spree. According to Wikipedia, Clara was pregnant. At his Kenora, Ontario trial, Thomas pled drunkenness and was convicted after 3 hours' deliberation by the jury, which did not recommend mercy. Thomas Young had no last words. His victims were OPP Constable Calvin Russell Fulford, 28. His father, Albert Young, 47. Clara Gordon, 16. Walter, a.k.a. Jimmy Gordon, 18. Some accounts say 26. And finally, George Williams, 47. Unlike most of the condemned killers featured on this channel, Thomas Young appears on Wikipedia, the wiki article being the primary source for today's video. All other sources are listed in the description. Marvin Harold McKee, hanged February the 9th, 1960. At 12:09 a.m. on Tuesday, February the 9th, 1960, Marvin Harold McKee, 20, was hanged at the Parry Sound, Ontario jail for the murder of Huntsville, Ontario cab driver Bruce Spears, 22. McKee went to his death quietly and confessed shortly before his execution. McKee had willed his eyes to the eye bank and asked to be buried in the jail yard as a warning to young people to lead better lives. McKee, who was described by the Huntsville Forester newspaper, the Huntsville Forester, as having long sideburns and an Elvis Presley haircut, was pronounced dead at 12:20 a.m. He was the first person under the age of 21 to have been hung since 1953. Not everyone was pleased with McKee's choice of final resting place, complaining that, even in the jail yard, the convicted murderer's body was buried too darn close to the town's main street. The crime for which McKee would hang took place on June the 17th, 1959, at a gravel pit in Dwight, Ontario, near Huntsville, where the condemned man and his accomplice, Wayne Sluman, then 16, had lured Spears and his partner, Francis, a.k.a. Fritz Grosso, aged 29. Both men had been shot in the head with a sawed-off .22 rifle, their bodies being found 11 days after the murders. The killers had initially fled the scene, but returned the next day to rob the bodies and found that Spears was still alive. His skull was then crushed, apparently by McKee, to finish him off. The motive for this double murder was robbery, the crime netting a mere $24. The pair kept the stolen taxi and even drove it down to Oshawa, where they picked up a 17-year-old girl, Annie Young, and spent several days hiding out in the bush before Sluman was arrested and McKee and Young were picked up near Elk Lake, Ontario. The trial of both men took place at Bracebridge, Ontario, where on November the 7th, 1959, the all-male jury took only 48 minutes to find McKee guilty, causing him to snarl, "And you call this justice?" His accomplice, Sluman, would plead guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in the Kingston Penitentiary. Not much has been written about this case, and my primary sources of information have been newspaper reports found via the Google News archive. McKee rates a single reference in The Last Dance, Murder in Canada, where author Neil Boyd describes him as being of, quote, below average mentality, end of quote. End of Marvin Harold McKee. Ernest Cote, hanged March the 11th, 1960. On Friday, March the 11th, 1960, Ernest Cote, 37, was hanged at Montreal's Bordeaux jail for the murder of a Temiskaming bank manager. He was pronounced dead at 12:08 a.m. and has the dubious distinction of being the last man hanged in both Montreal and in the province of Quebec. Cote, a native of North Bay, Ontario, had spent most of his life in prison. He had just finished serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery when he was arrested for killing bank manager Alexandra Heron, who was shot 3 times during an abortive attempt to rob the Bank of Montreal branch in Temiskaming, Quebec, on May the 15th, 1959. Cote's murder trial was held at Hull, Quebec, and the all-male jury arrived at their guilty verdict in only 15 minutes. Cote's co-accused, Ronald Kyle Alexander Brush, 20, was acquitted of murder as he refused to enter the bank during the course of the holdup. He was, however, sentenced to 3 years for attempted robbery. As an interesting side note, Brush was successfully defended on the murder charge by a female lawyer. You get Marie Charette. But, once again, the jury was strictly male. The jury that convicted Cote of Heron's murder did not recommend mercy, so when the condemned man learned on Thursday afternoon that his sentence would not be commuted, he appeared to take the news calmly enough. His only comment on learning he would indeed hang was, "I'm sorry it had to be that way." Yet, as the hour of his execution drew near, Cote became agitated and was slightly injured after he threw himself against the wall of his cell. Cote, a Roman Catholic, refused the last rites of the church, a midnight mass, and thus went to his death 30 minutes early. The day after the execution, Cote's mother, who lived in North Bay, released an 8-page typed letter from her son in which he argued against capital punishment. Among his conclusions, quote, "Guilty of murder or not, my execution will in no way deter future bank robbers. As of that, one can be certain." End of quote. My main sources for this account of the execution of Ernest Cote were newspapers accessed via the Google News Archive. The Google News Archive, Google, the best of them being the Regina Leader-Post. Cote is briefly mentioned in Neil Boyd's The Last Dance, Murder in Canada. He rates one whole sentence. Alan Hustack's They Were Hanged, which provides accounts of the last person hanged in each Canadian province, lists a completely different case, that of Henri Hector Legault, as the last Quebec execution. But that dubious honor belongs to Ernest Cote. All of my sources are listed in the description. Robert Raymond Cook, hanged November the 15th, 1960. At 12:05 a.m. on Tuesday, November the 15th, 1960, Robert Raymond Cook, a.k.a. Bobby, 23, was hanged at the Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta, Provincial Jail for the June 1959 slaughter of his entire family at Stettler, Alberta. His victims included his father, Albert Raymond Cook, aged 52, his stepmother, Daisy May, 37, and his half-siblings, Gerald, 9, Patrick, 8, Christopher, 6, Kathy, 4, and Linda May, 3. Albert Cook had been shot in the chest, while Daisy had most of her head blown off. The children had all been bludgeoned with a shotgun, so violently the gun's wooden stock had splintered into 2 pieces. Cook was a troubled young man who had racked up 19 convictions in the last 7 years, primarily for auto theft and burglary. On Tuesday, June the 23rd, 1959, he was released from the Saskatchewan Penitentiary as part of an amnesty of non-violent offenders in honor of Queen Elizabeth's visit to Canada. After partying with prison friends in Saskatoon, Cook traveled to Edmonton, where on Wednesday, June the 24th, he became enamored with a 59 Chevy Impala convertible. Thursday, June the 25th, Cook was driven out to Stettler by an ex-con and hung around town all day before his father, Albert, picked him up in the family station wagon between 8:30 and 9:15 p.m. It is believed they went to the Cook home, but wherever they went that night, Albert Cook, his wife Daisy, and their 5 children were never seen alive after Robert drove off with his father. In fact, the Cooks were next seen when their decomposing bodies were found buried in the grease pit of their garage. On Friday, June the 26th, Cook appeared at Hood Motors in Edmonton and used his father's identification to trade the family station wagon in for a white Impala convertible with red upholstery, disappearing with the car before all the necessary paperwork was completed. Cook would then embark on an aimless cruise around rural Alberta, eventually arriving back in Stettler on Saturday, June the 27th, when he was stopped by the RCMP over the irregularities involved in his purchase of the Impala. Police went to the Cook home in search of Albert, and on their second visit discovered the bodies in the grease pit. While serving his last sentence in the Saskatchewan penitentiary, Cook had been attacked by a fellow con, Oliver DeRoche, and was struck in the head 4 times with a lead pipe, resulting in wounds that required some 28 stitches. Given this head injury and the atrocious nature of his crime, Cook was sent to the Ponoka Mental Hospital for psychiatric evaluation. Denied the opportunity to attend his family's funeral, Cook escaped but was recaptured after an 84-hour manhunt. Cook was tried and convicted of murder twice. He was a good-looking and personable young man, so many still refuse to believe that he slaughtered his family for a Chevy convertible. The question of Cook's guilt or innocence is too complicated for this short video, but if listeners are interested in having me examine this issue in detail, please let me know in the comments. A lot has been written about Bobby Cook. My primary resource was The Robert Cook Murder Case, an Alberta story by Frank W. Anderson, whose own case was recently covered on this channel. All other sources are listed in the description. Mickey Feener, hanged July the 13th, 1961. On July the 13th, 1961, Owen Maxwell Feener, 23, who went by the nickname Mickey, was hanged at the Temiskaming District Jail in Haileybury, Ontario, for the beating and stabbing murder of 26-year-old Kathleen K. Chouinard at Timmins, Ontario, on October the 4th, 1960. Feener was born in Nova Scotia and worked as a hard rock miner. He came from a dysfunctional family and had an IQ in the 60s, often being described as retarded. But, in spite of his lack of intelligence, the 6-foot blonde giant had no trouble attracting women. At the time of his arrest in Kirkland Lake, Ontario, he was initially detained on an outstanding reckless driving charge. Feener was driving a red Austin Healey sports car, on the hood of which he had spelled his nickname Mickey in adhesive tape. A red Austin Healey sports car which belonged to a woman named Kathy Essers, who he had murdered near Fredericton, New Brunswick, in September 1960. As Esser's decomposing body had been discovered, he was detained, and when confronted by Timmins police, who were investigating Kay Chouinard's disappearance, he confessed to killing her and led police to her battered body. Taped to the sports car's dash were pictures of 8 young women. One was Kay Chouinard, one was Kathy Essers, and one was of Dolly Woods, a 17-year-old waitress who had disappeared from Kirkland Lake in April 1959. Feener would confess to her murder shortly before his execution. The 5 other young women were never identified. Feener said he murdered Kay Chouinard as she became upset, quite naturally, after he told her of killing Kathy Essers. Feener suffered from epilepsy and had received a serious head wound from an accidental gunshot when he was 8 years old. It has been suggested that he committed his murders when in an epileptic trance. An epileptic trance. But the jury took only 15 minutes to find him guilty, and he became the last of 9 men hanged at the Temiskaming District Jail. Feener's last meal consisted of steak, fries, and ice cream, while his last words on the scaffold were to the effect that Nova Scotia men were not afraid to die. Earlier, he had donated his eyes to an eye bank with the comment, quote, "I hope the poor devil who gets them trains himself to look at something besides skirts during the course of his life." Did Mickey Feener kill more than 3 women? Was he a serial killer? The secret died with him. The primary source for today's video is the section on Feener in The Last Dance, Murder in Canada by criminologist Neil Boyd. I also read an article by a woman claiming to be Feener's daughter. I've put a link to it and various other sources in the description. Louis Fisher, hanged June 27th, 1961. On Tuesday, June the 27th, 1961, Louis William Baldwin Fisher, 25, was hanged at Toronto's Don Jail for the stabbing murder of 36-year-old Margaret Peggy Bennett on June the 10th, 1960. On the fatal evening of June the 9th, Fisher, his wife, and 2 friends went to the beer parlor at the Wembley Hotel on Toronto's Danforth Avenue. Fisher's wife left shortly thereafter, but he stayed on until closing time, which was just after midnight, having consumed, by his own admission, as many as 25 glasses of beer. After leaving the beverage room, Fisher encountered Peggy Bennett, a woman he knew by sight, who inquired if he had his car. Telling her to wait, he went home and fetched it, returning to the Wembley to pick her up. Bennett suggested they go to a restaurant for coffee, but Fisher demurred, claiming to have no money. But when Bennett wanted a cigarette, he did stop at a restaurant where he could get a pack on credit. As they sat in the car smoking, Fisher said Bennett began to fondle him. He drove off and she continued fondling him. Eventually, Fisher told Bennett, as reported in Fisher's appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, that, quote, if she wanted to get it, she was going to get it. And so he pulled into a gas station parking lot and stabbed her a minimum of 15 times before pushing her body out of the car. Fisher would later tell the police, quote, "I really went off my rocker, I guess, or I must have been drunk, or a combination of both." Perhaps, but the psychiatrist called by the prosecution said Fisher, in spite of all the beer he had consumed, was still able to form the intent to commit murder, and Fisher hanged, leaving a wife and 4 children. His last words on the scaffold were, "The Lord is my shepherd." Fisher was pronounced dead at 12:03 a.m. As an interesting side note, there was a full moon on June the 9th, 1960, and during the early morning hours of June the 10th. My primary sources for today's video is the text of the Supreme Court judgment when Fisher's appeal was denied. The case is also briefly mentioned in The Practice of Execution in Canada by Ken Leighton Brown. I also looked at a document entitled Ontario Cemeteries Act Site Investigation, the Old Don Jail Burial Site. Arthur Lucas, hanged December 11th, 1962. On Tuesday, December 11th, 1962, Arthur Lucas, an African-American from Detroit, Michigan, was hanged at midnight in Toronto's Don Jail for the November 17th, 1961 gangster murder of Thurland Crater, Detroit pimp and witness in an upcoming narcotics trial. Murdered at the same time at the Kendall Avenue rooming house in Toronto's Annex neighborhood was Carolyn Ann Newman, a 20-year-old prostitute. Both Crater and Newman had their throats cut, with Crater also being shot 4 times. Newman, Crater, and Lucas, a 54-year-old panderer, were all African American and members of the Detroit underworld, Lucas having been sent to silence Crater. Hanged at the same time as Lucas was Ronald Turpin, a 29-year-old cop killer who died for the murder of Metropolitan Toronto Police Constable Frederick John Nash. Lucas, a man of limited intelligence, was convicted on purely circumstantial evidence, as no witness could place him at the scene of the double homicide. He went to his death proclaiming his innocence. Lucas was tried only for the murder of Thurland Crater. Amazingly, Robert J. Hashosky, in his book The Last to Die, Ronald Turpin, Arthur Lucas, and the End of Capital Punishment in Canada, references a 1967 news program, W5, which tracked down 4 members of the jury that convicted Lucas, and 3 of the 4 expressed doubts as to his guilt. What the actual hell? Then why did they convict him? For a more detailed discussion of Lucas's trial and potential innocence, I highly recommend Hashosky's The Last to Die, which should be easily obtainable for listeners in Canada. Both Arthur Lucas and Ronald Turpin were pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m., but among the revelations found in The Last to Die was the bungling of Lucas's execution, his head being practically ripped from his body. After an early morning inquest, both of the condemned men were buried in unmarked graves in Toronto's Prospect Cemetery. As an aside, I spent the summer of 1980 living in an annex rooming house 1 block east of the Kendall Avenue double murder site. Ronald Turpin, hanged December 11th, 1962. On Tuesday, December the 11th, 1962, Ronald Turpin was hanged at midnight in Toronto's Don Jail for the murder of Metropolitan Toronto Police Constable Frederick John Nash in a shootout on Danforth Avenue during the early morning hours of February the 12th, 1962. Turpin was a 28-year-old career criminal who had a paranoid fear of being beaten or murdered by the police. At his trial, Turpin would claim that Nash fired first and that he had shot back in self-defense. The jury did not believe him. Nash had pulled over Turpin's battered 1954 Pontiac van shortly after the latter, Turpin, had burgled the nearby Red Rooster restaurant for a haul of $600. The constable had recognized the burglar from his appearance on a wanted poster, the charge against Turpin being shoot with intent. Hanged at the same time with Turpin was Arthur Lucas, a Detroit pimp sentenced to death for the gangland murder of Thurland Crater in Toronto in 1961. Both Turpin and Lucas were pronounced dead at 12:18 a.m. and were buried in unmarked graves in Toronto's Prospect Cemetery. Ronald Turpin has the dubious honor of being the last person sentenced to death in Canada who was actually hanged. The material for today's video comes from two main sources: The Last to Hang by Robert J. Hoshowski and The Practice of Execution in Canada by Ken Leighton Brown. Both authors note that the double execution led to considerable public protest, a crowd of anti-hanging picketers gathering outside the Don Jail on the night of the fatal event. If you enjoyed today's video, please drop a like, comment, and consider subscribing to The Gallows, where we explore Canadian murder cases which ended on the scaffold. And remember, if you're born to hang, you'll never be shot. Cheers.